I'm curious. I am curious. Curious
by nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Wildfires are often seen as destructive, but history tells a different story. Today, our guest studies the deep relationship between people, fire, and landscapes, uncovering how Indigenous fire practices shaped ecosystems for centuries. Using tree rings and archaeology, Dr. Christopher Roos reveals how the Western Apache managed fire to buffer against drought and climate extremes, lessons that could guide us today as wildfires grow more severe. His work connects the past to the present, showing how cultural knowledge and science together can help us live with fire, not just fight it. Dr. Roos, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Christopher Roos. I'm at Southern Methodist University, and I'm a professor of anthropology and earth sciences. I'm curious about the long histories of traditional burning practices by societies in the past and what kind of lessons we can learn from those experiences for modern wildfire problems today.
Can you tell me more about what you do and what you research?
I'm an environmental archaeologist and a pyrogeographer. Pyrogeography, it's a relatively new field, kind of neologism. The idea is pretty simple. It's kind of the holistic study of fire on Earth, kind of across space and time. So it's really kind of the historical and geographic dimensions of fire science, from everything from ecology and evolution to the human experience. As an anthropologist and an archaeologist, I'm very solidly on kind of the human dimension of things, but I try to couch my work in this larger pyrogeographic framework so that it's relevant to other fire scientists, but also to be able to leverage what we know about fire behavior, fire ecology, fire impacts through the work that I do, again, to try to make the most of these past human experiences for contemporary wildfire problems.
And so that brings us into your recent paper. Can you tell us about that?
So I recently published a large synthesis of tree ring studies. Dendrochronology is the study of time in trees, literally, but that means you can study just about anything recorded in the history of the life history of that tree, everything from avalanches and earthquakes and droughts to fires. And so a tree that survives a fire will take a little bit of damage, and as it tries to regrow over that damage, you can use tree ring dating methods to identify not just the year, but in many cases, maybe even the month in which that wildfire happened. And so across Arizona and New Mexico, where I do a lot of my work, we literally have several thousand trees recording fires, up to 600, 700 years ago across the region, mostly in what we think of as kind of dry pine forests. So these are forests that experience kind of seasonal drought. Historically would have been very open with a lot of grass underneath them. And as a result, the fires that burned through them didn't kill most of the trees, but they could leave damage and therefore leave this record of fires that would happen once or twice a decade. And very recently, I've worked with colleagues in both dendrochronology, but also with fire scientists and archaeologists from the San Carlos Apache tribe and the White Mountain Apache tribe to try to understand the record in Western Apache homelands in central and eastern Arizona, and the evidence for fire management by Western Apache people, who historically were very low density population, very mobile, but ethnographically we had some evidence that they managed fire. And we wanted to see what that was, and again, what kind of lessons we could learn from the experience of Western Apaches and their management of fire.
How did they manage fire? Do you have any ideas about or know any information about maybe how they managed the fires?
Yeah, we have some information from ethnographies that were done in the early part of the 20th century that document Western Apache use of fire in both kind of foraging and hunting, but also in horticulture. Western Apaches were a little different than other Apache groups in that they did grow some corn, beans, and squash, but it made up a very small amount of their diet. But they used to use fire to clean irrigation ditches, to establish new garden plots, to kind of reset succession for wild plants, including medicinal plants, but also wild tobacco and even cultivated tobacco, to kind of improve forage for important game like deer. Hunting was a really important part of the diet, and so managing habitat for deer was really important. But this was in the these ethnographies happened in the early middle part of the 20th century, after a lot of these practices were starting to go kind of go out of circulation, if you will. So we wondered, how impactful these things were, how representative they were, and so we really dove into the tree rings, and a record of about 650 trees stretching from the Flagstaff area all the way over into the San Carlos Apache area, to see what evidence was there for fire activity that was different in the Western Apache homeland compared to the thousands of trees we have from all across Arizona and New Mexico.
Okay, so when you talk about their fire management, you're talking about how they utilized fire to both to create land and in their farming practices. But what about if there was a forest fire? Did they manage that in some way?
That's a very good question. The peak of kind of what we think of as the natural lightning fire season for Apaches would oftentimes have Apaches in different parts of the landscape, and there's nothing explicit in the ethnography, but one thought and our interpretation of what's happening when they're burning around their farm sites, their kind of long-term campsites in these pine forests early in the fire season, mostly in kind of late April and May, they're fireproofing effectively against the spread of later, maybe lightning started wildfires. But that's an inference on our part about that we definitely see it as a consequence, but the intentions of that are kind of hidden in the ethnography.
So what are some of the takeaways that people today can learn from the Western Apache?
Yeah, I think one thing that really stands out, and in the Southwest, we see this emerging not just with Apaches, but also in other places that I've worked in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, or with the Chiricahua Apache, or with the Navajo, is that one of the big differences between the kind of indigenous cultural burning regime versus, say, a lightning-driven fire regime is that the fires are overwhelmingly small and kind of patchy. And what that does is it creates kind of a self-limiting effect in terms of fire spread, so that as a result, all the fires end up being smaller. Because even the lightning started fires run into these patches of previously burned area from the cultural burns, and so that overall, during these periods of time and in these places where indigenous people are burning, mostly lots of small fires, it creates a much more kind of mosaic pattern of lots of small fires. And that one of the consequences of this is that climate ends up having a much smaller role in fire activity. Because what climate tends to do in the areas where you don't have this type of indigenous fire management is that it kind of grows large abundance of fuels, and then it dries them out and burns them over a huge area. And that just can't happen because of the mosaic. And so this is a little bit different than the way we think about, say, prescribed burning today. Contemporary forest managers are really kind of handcuffed by environmental regulations and procedure that make it very difficult for them to do as much burning as they would like. They would really like to do a lot more burning. And as a result, they tend to aim for larger burn areas for prescribed burns.
It seems like a very complicated study. I mean, so how do you get the tree rings? How do you analyze them? Do you have to cut the tree?
Yes. So you don't necessarily have to kill the tree to do it. You can take what's called, in the business, a cookie, where you use a chainsaw very skillfully to basically cut a little wedge out of the fire scar itself. And then the tree survives that and lives on. Although in many cases now, we avoid living trees as much as we can.
Hmm.
Uh, Partly because the oldest records are usually in dead and down trees, either stumps that were cut from logging in the past and just cut the top of the stump off, or dead and down wood that might be in a rocky place that's kind of been protected from fire since it fell, and you can those you can just cut a cross section out of as well, because the one of the other things, other than trying to grow back over, to heal itself, the tree kind of floods that scarred area with resin to try to keep insects out, protect itself. But that resin that's in there makes it really resistant to decay. So that stuff can actually sit on the landscape. But the oldest fire scars we have are kind of inevitably from, down old wood that's been sitting there for a very, very, very long time and preserved because it's been kind of flooded with resin.
Are there databases of basically the tree rings?
Yes. So some of my colleagues on the paper, um, Chris Gitterman and another dendrochronologist, Ellis Margolis, have kind of led the effort to build what's called the North American Fire Scar Network, where they've gotten other scientists who do this work to kind of contribute their data all across North America, from Mexico up through Canada, to build this record so they can actually ask continental scale questions with this. And that's what enabled this study too. I mean, it'd be one thing maybe just to look at the Apache records and say, oh well, these seem to be really short, but we know that they're really unusual because I could compare them to the rest of the region, and that was put together as a part of that effort.
That seems like it would be very helpful and necessary, and also all the valuable data that could be used moving forward. There might be other things in the future that you can see from
Absolutely.
in your current work in this current study as well as your work until today. What is the effect of cultural burning on the climate?
It's a really good question, and it's been an important kind of piece of my work going back to my time working on the Apache reservation for my dissertation, because I think it's one of the ways that studying traditional burning or indigenous cultural burning can be generalizable, even though the societal context is obviously very different. Obviously, the communities in Arizona today are not mobile foragers, or they're not true subsistence farmers or things like that. Um, but I think understanding how these cultural burning practices influence the way that climate as a top-down kind of mechanism on fire activity occurs is something that can tell us a lot. And there have been some work in Australia that suggested that burning by Aboriginal foragers had kind of buffered the impacts of El Nino, La Nina oscillations, mostly through precipitation. So that buffered the impact of drought, for example. Um, and one of the kind of focal questions for me using tree rings to study indigenous cultural burning and its consequences is because the tree rings are annually resolved. The dating precision is outstanding, but also because other independent tree ring records can be used to reconstruct properties of the climate. And so bringing those two things together, and this is nothing new for me, other people have been looking at paleo climate records and fire history records for a long time. Um, it's such a natural fit because you can look at it at a resolution that matches vegetation growth and productivity and drought on the ground, right? That would actually influence actual fires. And we had this hypothesis, coming partly out of the Australia work, that maybe burning by indigenous people might actually mute or buffer the influence of climate.
What areas of the US would you say would be your first target areas if they could implement cultural burning there?
California is probably the first place because there are indigenous communities in California who never let go of their fire knowledge. So they have very detailed, very nuanced landscape and ecological knowledge and the application of fire. And they're basically, there are some communities there that are doing it.
What would you say are the areas that are maybe the most, or I mean, I know that this is subjective, but very treasured and kind of special places around the country that would and are at high risk for destruction and through fires and could really utilize this knowledge of cultural burning?
One of the first places that comes to mind are the giant sequoia groves in California that themselves have a fire score record of pretty frequent burning over the last up to 3,000 years. And my colleague Tom Swetnam, who's done a lot of the work there, is pretty convinced that a lot of that is cultural burning, and that the vulnerability that the giant sequoia groves have experienced in California fires of the last few years have been because of fire exclusion and infilling by this fire intolerant trees. And so that's that, because of when we think about forests and people think about kind of iconic forests, giant sequoias really stand out, right? As they're so charismatic, so telegenic, that and they're so kind of unique and endangered that doing what we can to protect those, I think, would be big and important. Number two, though, for me, probably would be Grand Canyon. I started my archaeology career at the Grand Canyon, and so this summer has hurt a lot to see the North Rim devastated like it has been.
So many places, so many. And so none of these places that are kind of national parks and are monuments of the U.S. are utilizing this knowledge.
Well, I can't say that for sure. I can say that none of these places are utilizing it enough to have really demonstrable effects and benefit from it. And the federal agency, I think it's telling, I should say, I think it's telling that a lot of the restorative work with cultural burning in California is either happening on state land or on native land, or on private land for that matter, not on the federal agencies. The federal agencies are, and again, I would tie a lot of this back to the bureaucracy. It's just hard. It takes a lot to change those agencies.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.